Marc Sidwell, and my guests today are Daniel Freeman, Managing Editor at the Institute of Economic Affairs, and Albie Amankona, who's a broadcaster and financial analyst. Now, the UK government has stepped in to take control of British Steel, passing emergency legislation to keep the Scunthorpe blast furnaces running. Daniel, the Business Secretary, Jonathan Reynolds, says it was a case of national interest. But is this industrial intervention a savvy safeguard, or simply postponing a hard landing?
Probably the latter, in my view. I mean, the fundamental problem with the British steel industry at the moment is nothing to do with ownership. It's not a question of whether the steel industry is owned by the government or owned by private companies. It is simply a question of thermodynamics, in that steel is a hugely energy-intensive industry. And in Britain, we have some of the highest industrial electricity prices and energy prices in general in the world. And this is a situation that has got much, much worse over the last 20 years. So if you go back to the mid-2000s, industrial electricity was about a quarter of the price it is today. Whereas in many other parts of the world, you have seen energy prices remain stable, or in some cases drop. So in the US, industrial energy prices are roughly the same as where they were 20 years ago. And this just makes it very, very difficult for the British steel industry to compete. And the government taking over this plant in Scunthorpe isn't really going to make any difference unless they act to, cut the input costs.
Albie, I mean, do we need to be making our own steel? After all, as Daniel was saying, it's very expensive to do that here. And there are countries around the world who, for their own reasons, are actually subsidizing the costs of steel manufacture there. India, China, most famously. Shouldn't we just be welcoming the fact that we can buy cheap steel from these other places?
Well, there's certainly a utopian free market argument that, well, if the Chinese government are willing to subsidize their steel industry, why would we turn away that sort of opportunity of getting cheap steel from China or cheap steel from India? Because those governments are subsidizing those industries or having regulations that the British people would never accept. So the steel industry is a lot more unsafe in those countries. They don't have to pay them as much. We could just buy all of that steel because it's a lot cheaper. There's certainly that utopian free market argument that might have been an argument that would have been sensible to make in the early 2000s or the late 90s, when it looked like we were all sort of moving towards this liberal democratic direction. China was opening up its markets. We sort of thought the whole world was going to be remade in the image of the West. That hasn't gone so well over the past 5 years, and certainly not over the past 10 to 15 years. So other people would argue, actually, it is very important that countries in the West, whether or not it's the UK, countries like the Netherlands, Germany, the Nordic countries, the US, Canada, etc., have their own steel making capability, because steel is so important to almost every aspect of infrastructure, whether or not we're talking about energy, railways, house building, all of the things that I think all three of us want to see in this country, a lot more of, all require steel. And I think the other point that I would make is that I think if the UK was to lose this last virgin steel making plant, we'd be the only country in the G7 not to have virgin steel making capability. Now, of course, we could just import from another country, but I suppose the question is, if the Netherlands can have a steel industry, why can't the UK have a steel industry? And the government over decades has created regulatory and economic conditions that have made steel making unviable in the UK. And I think that can probably be reversed.
I suppose the question is, just because other countries have one, perhaps, does that matter to us? Should we be excited about this, or is this just sort of like a matter of national pride rather than economic good sense? I mean, Daniel, what's your take? Is this just utopian free market thinking? Should we be nationalising British steel and ramping up industry in the UK?
So I think there are kind of couple of separate components of the argument here. So if the argument is that would it be a bad thing if the only steel producers in the world were China and India, for example, or particularly China? Yeah, I would say there are grounds to say that that would have some bad security implications. But it's a separate question as to whether nationalising a blast furnace in Scunthorpe, which is losing about £700,000 a day, is the best way to look after your national security interests. So if we're taking the question of like steel for military purposes, the Britain already has a pretty developed arms industry and produce an awful lot of ships and that side of things. But the vast majority of the steel used for that is not British. Like if you take the Type 31 frigates that are being built at the moment, only about 2% of the steel used in them comes from British steel mills. The vast majority comes from other European countries, in large part because they have lower energy prices than us and are able to produce steel more cheaply. So if the argument is that I would agree it makes sense to have some steelmaking capacity in friendly countries, but the idea that it necessarily has to be in Britain, I don't think it adds up, not least because, well, in order to make steel, we have to import many of the inputs. So in order to produce steel, you need iron ore. And there is no iron ore production in Britain. It has to be imported from places like Sweden or Australia. So if you're already importing iron ore, you're already importing coking coal, well, I'm not sure what the scenario is in which you can't also import steel from, say, France or Spain or Germany or the Netherlands, as we already do on a very significant scale.
Albie, to come back to Daniel's point about energy prices, I mean, as you were saying, you think we should be, defending our steel production here. But if that comes down to the fact that our industrial energy prices are just very, very high, and that comes down to various net zero policies that have been instituted for other reasons, does that mean we've got to look very hard at the approach to green regulation that's gone on in the UK in order to bring down those energy prices if we really want to see steel making here?
The only way that steelmaking is going to be viable, either as something which the taxpayer is going to be happy to pay for, with it being a nationalised industry, or a private business running it so the state doesn't have to be involved, is if the economic and regulatory conditions in this country allow for steelmaking to be viable. And one of the key factors, if not the key factor in that, will be industrial energy prices. And I suppose I do not accept that the UK has to be forever the country with the highest industrial energy policies anywhere in the world. I don't accept that. I reject that on the strongest possible terms. It's not always been this way. It doesn't always have to be this way. High energy prices aren't just screwing up the steel industry, they're screwing up almost every industry. They're screwing up things for consumers as well. So they're not just skewing up the business to business market, they're skewing up the business to consumer market as well and pushing up prices for everything. So the energy cost situation in this country is really bad, for lack of a better phrase. I want to use a much stronger phrase than that, but I won't because we're professionals. But it's bad. It's terrible. The cost of energy in this country is incredibly high. And the amount of money that you actually spend on energy, if you spend £1 on energy, you'd probably think all of that pound goes on power. It doesn't. It goes on taxation, it goes on green levies, it goes on all sorts of other things. So if we can sort that out, we can get energy prices down, and then actually not just the steel industry could work in this country, but other industries, and prices could be lower for consumers as well.
As we talk, we're waiting to see whether the government, having intervened in Scunthorpe, is going to be able to keep those blast furnaces running. So we shall keep watching to see if steel making manages to, or virgin steel making manages to stay in the UK. Manufacturing has been in decline as a share of the US economy for decades, while income inequality has soared. Albie, President Trump says his tariff plan will bring back factory jobs to America and rebalance the books. But is this revival plan grounded in economic reality or just nostalgia dressed up as policy?
I think it's probably grounded in a little bit of both. I think there is a lot of nostalgia around what tariffs can do, and perhaps not enough realism about what we all know is the impact of tariffs if we just look back at economic history over the past 150, 100 years. We know that actually, ultimately, what happens with tariffs in a positive scenario is there might be short-term pain, mid-term gain, and then long-term pain, because ultimately what it does is it makes industries less efficient, it makes industries in particular countries less innovative. It means that countries have got to do all of these different things for themselves rather than relying on their comparative advantages. Why should a country that has no trees have to be chopping down its own wood? It just doesn't really work. And we do know that the globalized free market system has dragged billions of people out of poverty over the past 100 and 150 years. If we especially look at the last 50 years with what's happened in China since they opened up their economy, we've seen one of the biggest increases in prosperity we've ever seen. So we know this stuff works, but I suppose in the 2020s, there are a lot of people, perhaps in the Rust Belt in the US. I don't really know if the same analogy works for Europe, but certainly in the Rust Belt in the US, who have not been feeling the gains of globalization and free market capitalism and free trade in the same way as other people perhaps on the coast. And yes, they might be spending less on food, and yes, their iPhones might be cheaper, but they've lost something about their communities, the jobs that they all used to do, the sense of purpose that they had. And so I can understand why the sweet nectar of protectionism that Donald Trump is selling to the American people is getting people very excited about the future of things. But we know that it doesn't end well.
Doesn't end well, and that they may come to regret thinking that cheaper food was something that was just sort of a minor thing rather than a real benefit. I mean, Daniel, are manufacturing jobs coming back to America's heartland, and will Americans who live there be grateful for it?
Well, I think when talking about this, it's important to remember that US manufacturing has declined as a proportion of the US economy. But in absolute terms, actually, over the last 10 years in particular, it's actually been growing. It's been growing at a fairly impressive rate. But in areas that the US has a comparative advantage. So not in the sort of low end manufacturing of things like like trainers and textiles and that kind of thing, but in higher end manufacturing goods, and that's an area where the US can have real advantages. I think so. I mean, if the question is purely focused on jobs, I think there is some interesting evidence that we have on this from the first Trump administration, where the first Trump administration introduced some specific targeted tariffs on certain industries. So one of their big examples that they were sort of trumpeting was a tariff that they imposed on washing machines. And this did lead to some washing machine companies relocating some of their production to the US. But the issue is that for every one additional job you got in the US, it resulted in about $800,000 per year in additional costs to the US consumer. So this is the fundamental problem with tariffs, is there are some people who benefit and some companies who benefit from locking out competition. and those people tend to be very, very aware of it. But the costs are distributed across society on the whole, and they often are really astronomical when you actually look at it. It's just because it's the costs are distributed, people don't immediately notice. Now, with this set of tariffs, because they are so broad, especially if this 90-day delay is just a 90-day delay rather than a permanent sort of suspension of these high rates of tariffs on, countries like Vietnam and Cambodia and various other countries, people are going to notice the difference, because it will affect every single product rather than just one or two products.
As you were saying before, Daniel, when we were talking about steel, and you were saying, well, if we want to do that, we need the ore, we need the coking coal, we've got to have the imports. It's surely true too that US manufacturing is fundamentally reliant on imports, and those are going to be hit by these tariffs. So manufacturing is suddenly becoming, in fact, very, very expensive in America, more so. So it's hard to see that being the basis for a manufacturing renaissance. I mean,
yes,
go on. No, go on.
No,
Daniel.
I mean that's absolutely right. I think like the vast majority of economists who have ever lived in the last 200 years think that free trade is a good thing. It makes everyone richer. But even if you are trying to pursue a sort of protectionist industrial growth led policy via tariffs, the way Trump has sort of organized his tariffs seemed to be a really, really stupid way of going about it, because you're applying blanket tariffs, including on goods that you need, that are input goods, so goods that you need in order to manufacture things. It's American industry is not going to benefit from the fact that machine tools from Germany are now 10% more expensive. American manufacturing is not going to benefit from having to pay more for Australian iron ore. Like, none of these things actually benefit American industry, even if you're looking at it from the perspective of a protectionist.
And of course, another thing that's happened, curiously enough, is that Trump, in the process of tacking away from Joe Biden's approach, is that Joe Biden had put in place a system of sort of industrial strategy of subsidizing in order to reshore critical bits of manufacturing to the US, which was actually starting to work in semiconductors and other things. And now Trump's moving away from that. So, I mean, whether or not that was the right policy direction either, that was at least something that was moving the needle on manufacturing, which now he seems to be rowing back on and trying to do it all with tariffs. Albie, perhaps, do you think the real problem here is just that Trump's view is very backward looking, making America great again, looking back to the previous era of manufacturing, but really in the future aren't manufacturing jobs going away? They're going to be, AI control. There's going to be a job for robots. Should we really, if Trump's interested in thinking about jobs for Americans in the world that's coming, he should be focused on something else, not on looking backward?
I think that's one way of looking at it. I mean, the companies that I look at in my finance role are all technology, media, and telecoms companies. And I have been having this conversation with people in the industries that I look at for the past 4 years about automation. And we're not even close to 100% automation. We're not even close to 50% automation in some industries. Now, I'm not saying that we're never going to get there. We will get there. But I think the conversation about automation taking lots of people's jobs in heavy industry is a conversation that people are having, but it's not really come to fruition just yet. I do definitely think there will still be a need for human inputted manufacturing for some time yet in certain industries. For example, if we think about the semiconductor supply chain, and this is where I think actually Trump's tariffs are interesting, because if we think that the majority of advanced node semiconductors, so semiconductors of a certain size that go into all of the most high-tech equipment, a very, very high proportion of those semiconductors are made in Taiwan. And one of the big concerns, geopolitical concerns, probably of this century, is that if China decides to invade Taiwan, like, the West is literally screwed. So does it make sense, therefore, to have this very critical manufacturing base in Taiwan, which could be invaded by China at any time? And therefore, is there a security argument and an economic argument to say we should be trying to reshore that manufacturing capacity? It won't happen in Europe because it's too expensive to manufacture anything like that in Europe, but perhaps in the US, for example, maybe in Latin America, somewhere like that. Now, the semiconductor supply chain is very expensive and no one really wants to move around. But the point is, can the tariffs do something to rebalance some of the strategic challenges that have arisen out of a globalized system where we thought we were all moving in the same direction, but now we're no longer moving in that direction anymore? So there might be a role for tariffs there. But overall, I would agree with Daniel that actually, if we're talking about putting tariffs 10% on everything, well, what's the point in putting a 10% tariff on a piece of semiconductor manufacturing equipment from the Netherlands, which is the only place that makes it, if you want to make those advanced node semiconductors in the US? It's a blanket way of doing it rather than a strategic way of doing it, even if there could be some benefit from moving some of that critical manufacturing capacity from the East to the West.
Yeah, well, Donald Trump's tariffs on semiconductors and other bits of technologies are still in flux as we talk. So we'll continue to see what lines he draws there and whether it can actually do the job that you suggest might need doing from a strategic point of view. Finally today, across Europe, populists are riding a wave of public frustration, from stagnant wages to sluggish services. But as Bartek Stanislavski argued in CapX, it's clear-headed economic reform, not populist posturing, that drives prosperity. Daniel, if history backs the centre-right, which the research in Bartek's article was talking about, how can we convince voters?
Well, fortunately, that isn't my problem. Not working for a centre-right party, but I'm very interested in reading this report once it does fully come out, because as I understand it from Bartek's article, basically they've looked at various European countries, looked at their level of economic growth under various governments, centre-right, left-wing ones, and populist ones, and found that in each of these countries you tend to have more growth under centre-right governments. I suppose the question I'd have of this kind of analysis is what's the best point of comparison? So if you can say, okay, centre-right governments tend to perform better than centre-left ones economically in each country, that doesn't necessarily mean that the centre-right has done particularly well. And I think we found this in a lot of Europe over the last, certainly Western Europe over the last 15 to 20 years, is across the board, we've had really, really sluggish growth. Under left-wing governments, under centre-right governments, under vaguely populist governments. And it would sort of lead me to question sort of how important is actual, like, the brand of party in power? Because if we look across the Atlantic to the United States, there you've got politics that on the face of it looks far worse by almost any measure. It's far more populist than most European politics. And yet up to now, we'll see what Trump's tariffs actually do, the US has had much more impressive growth over the last 15 years than any Western European country. And it does lead me to question slightly Bartek's analysis in the article, which is that, the centre right clearly works best because it has respect for markets and also respect for institutions. Well, in Europe, in Britain, the Conservative Party is much more sort of respectful of British institutions than the US Republican Party has been. And yet we've had incredibly sluggish growth. So this isn't to say like, oh, populism is good, or any more than like the left is good. It's just that I think we probably need to sort of look more deeply at sort of why growth happens and which institutions are pro-growth and which institutions are negative for growth.
It's interesting to look at Keir Starmer's Labour Party, which is sort of pivoting and evolving its political views as it tries to cope with Britain's sort of low growth trap. And in many ways, they've seemed to have adopted, I mean, not fully, but they seem to have adopted some of this sort of package of what Daniel was saying has sort of come under the centre-right banner, I suppose, in the UK. I mean, Labour's turning towards welfare reform. It's talking about deregulation. It's talking about the need for infrastructure to be built and house building and so on. Do you think that's a sign that Labour, never mind the political labels, is becoming a force that can get Britain out of its stagnation?
No, I don't think they can, because they're doing one thing which is pro-growth on one side and another thing which is anti-growth on another side. So let's talk about their planning reform. Look, no one's going to disagree with their planning reform. If you are a sort of free market, centre-right, economically liberal person that thinks the Conservative Party didn't do enough during their 14 years in government to clean up the planning system and get more planning approvals through, of course you're going to agree with Labour's planning reform. Indeed, the OBR thinks it's going to be the main thing that's going to drive the measly amount of growth that we're going to get over the past couple of years. But then pulling in the other direction, you've got their new workers' rights legislation that they want to bring forward. You've got what Kemi Badenoch would call the jobs tax and national insurance contributions, employers national insurance contributions increase, which has just started hitting employers now, which means that lots of people's hiring plans have changed. They're not hiring as many people, not creating as many jobs, even laying people off as a direct result of this tax. So on the one hand, you've got a growth creating policy, planning reform, and on the other hand, you've got a growth stifling policy, this workers' rights legislation, and also this jobs tax, which has happened. So actually, what is going to be the impact of growth? Is it going to be zero, growth neutral, because you've got these two opposite forces pulling in the opposite direction? So I think unless there can be a party, and actually I would blame the Conservatives as well for that sort of thing, talking one way, behaving in another, introducing one form of policy to introduce another policy which completely counteracts it. I think Boris Johnson's Conservative government was an example of that as well. If we look at some of the net zero stances that he took, for example, and how that interplays with the earlier conversation that we had on British Steel, and now you've got all of these Conservatives complaining about what Labour are doing, when actually it was the conditions set by the Conservative Party which led to where we are today. So I think there's a problem in British politics, maybe less in other countries, where you have political parties that introduce policies that do one thing and then introduce another policy that does the opposite thing, and so nothing happens.
Daniel, we were hearing there about Labour and how it gets stuck, and obviously how the Conservatives have sort of failed to deliver, even as Bartek says, historically, maybe they've done slightly better. But Britain is clearly in an economic hole, and that's the frustration that leads to the popularity of something like reform. But then reform is caught too, because it's run by Nigel Farage, who is quite Thatcherite in his economic views in some ways, but then a lot of their voters are quite left-wing in their views, and some of the little policies that get floated are things that don't sound very sensible at all, like very expensive approaches to energy policy, burying pylons and one thing and another. Is it still the case that neither the populists nor the left can answer this question in the UK? So even though the Conservatives have failed so hard, they still seem like a better option to try and get some sort of sensible economic policy through.
Yeah, I mean, it depends. It depends what your area of priority is. Like as Albie pointed out, the current government is doing more in terms of liberalizing planning laws than the Conservatives ever managed to do. But yeah, on the other hand, you have the Employment Rights Bill, which is, I think the OBR estimates that's going to cost businesses about £5 billion a year. So you've got different, and of course you've got the net zero commitment, and a lot of these different priorities are pulling in different directions. And I think the real issue is that up until very recently, British politicians and European politicians more broadly have sort of thought that growth is this thing that just sort of happens. Like, oh, we had the financial crisis, we've had a few issues, but we're surely just about to get back to 2% trend growth. And that's actually, the OBR has been predicting this for about a decade actually, that if we just sort of carry on as we are, thing will start to regain sort of the levels of productivity growth that we saw in the late 20th century up until the financial crisis. And I think it's starting to finally dawn on politicians that no, that's not going to happen. Like, if you do actually want real per capita growth in GDP, you do have to engage in serious reforms. And that's something that I certainly hope centre-right parties are capable of doing, because otherwise, if centre-right parties don't succeed in doing that, people will turn to more radical parties. As in many ways, Trump is a sort of is an example of America being kind of ahead of the European curve on this. You have a Republican Party that started out looking a lot like the British Conservative Party, party that's sort of pro-business, and then it basically gets taken over by a more sort of populist wing. And that can, in his first term, in terms of economic policy, you didn't get too much that's disastrous. But the problem is, if you lean too far into this, you can just get these sorts of arbitrary, unstable policies, like to do with tariffs, that can undermine growth and confidence in the long run.
I think that's the problem, isn't it? We're in need of radical reform here, but bringing in a radical party is a way to end up with policy changes that can be quite destabilizing and not what you were really hoping for. I'm afraid that's all we have time for. We'll have to leave it there. Albie Amankona and Daniel Freeman, thank you. Make sure you're subscribed to our daily email briefings. Go to capx.co, that's capx.co. I'm Marc Sidwell. Goodbye.